Welcome to the second lecture from topic 11. And in this lecture, we're going to be looking at voter turnout, state electoral laws, and the impact that it has on participation. So first, we're going to take a look at current trends in voter turnout. And next, we're going to take a look at state electoral laws and the impact that that has on participation. So let's go ahead and get started. So the voter turnout in the United States is relatively low, and we'll talk about what that relatively low means in a moment. Voter turnout is the percentage of eligible individuals who actually vote, okay? And so you look at the population of either voter age population or voter eligible population. Just because you are 18 years or older doesn't mean you're actually eligible to vote. If you are a felon, you may have lost your right to vote. And your textbook talks about felony disenfranchisement and how, due to mass incarceration, we have more people who are actually ineligible to vote. And so when we talk about voter turnout, we usually are looking at the population of people who are eligible to vote compared to those who actually vote. And so if you have, let's say, 1,000 people who are eligible to vote and 600 of those people turn out to vote, then your voter turnout rate is 60%, 600 divided by 1,000. Now, I picked that number on purpose because that is about the level of voter turnout that we have in the United States when it comes to presidential elections. Now, in our final topic for the semester, topic 12, we're going to be looking at campaigns and elections, and you're going to be learning more about how elections are organized in the United States. We have two major federal elections. One is known as the presidential election. That's the election that we just had, where we elect the president of the United States, but we also elect members of Congress. And then 2 years after the presidential election, so in this case it would be 2022, that's what's known as the congressional election, or it's also known as and commonly called the midterm election, okay? Now, turnout in presidential election, more people vote in the presidential election than they do in other elections in the United States. And so you have the highest level of turnout during presidential elections. And there it's relatively low, is 60%. So 6 out of every 10 people vote in the presidential election. And but turnout in non-presidential election years is much lower. And so in midterm election years, you can get, significantly lower turnout. Turnout in the midterm election prior to 2016, turnout there was only 36% low. Now turnout in 2018 was 54%, which was the highest turnout we've ever had for a midterm election in modern electoral history. But we'll see if that continues with the subsequent midterm elections. I think voters really mobilized. The Trump presidency may turn out to be sort of an anomaly in terms of voter behavior. It remains to be seen. But we'll see if that continues into the future. But even there, it is less than the turnout that we have at the presidential election. And keep in mind that turnout at local elections and state elections can, be in the low teens, and for local elections can sometimes be in single digits. Okay. And so, midterm election turnout there is relatively low. And so when you think about 60% turnout at for the presidential elections, and 30 to 50, but again 50 is kind of high for midterm elections, and even lower for that for the other elections, turnout is low in the United States. We'll take a look at some graphs in a second, but when you compare voter turnout in the United States today than in the past, we've seen a decline in voter turnout, both in midterm and presidential elections. And when you compare voter turnout in the United States to other countries, we are quite low. So let's take a look at those graphs. So here's a figure from your textbook that shows voter turnout in presidential and midterm elections from 1892 to 2018. And you can see a trend that in terms of voting. I mean, since the mid part of the century, the 1930s and 40s, I mean, of the 20th century, we see some stability in terms of voter turnout. But in the 19th century and earlier than that, voter turnout rates were really high. There's several reasons for that. For one, the electorate was much smaller. Only certain people could vote: men, property owning men. And so when you have a smaller electorate, they're more, it's that they're more likely to be sort of politically enculturated to vote. When you expand the electorate, and when we passed the 19th Amendment in 1920, we expanded our electorate by half. And it takes a while for a group of people who didn't have voting rights to actually become like voters, to learn the culture of voting. And keep in mind that the 19th Amendment was controversial. Even women fought against the ratification of the 19th Amendment because they really didn't think that voting was, like electoral politics, was appropriate for women. So as you expand your electorate, new voters come in. That African American men got the right to vote in the 1870, but it wasn't until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s that where Black folks get fully enfranchised. So again, there's some figuring out how to be a voter. So that's part of it. Another part of it is that political parties used to play a much bigger role in American politics than they do today. And political parties, for better or for worse, they guide voters in terms of who they should vote for. It's a shortcut. You don't have to figure it out all on your own. You kind of follow your party politics, and you vote accordingly. And so parties play a much smaller role these days. Not partisanship and polarization, that's sort of different, right? That's like teams. But political parties have less control than they used to over candidates and mobilizing voters, etc. And so that also has contributed to a decline in voting in the United States. This figure shows you the comparison between the United States voter turnout and other democracies. And you'll see that we're second from the bottom, right? But it also sort of shows you the different kinds of regulations or mandates that are placed in voting in other countries. So you see the two top countries, Australia and Brazil, they have compulsory voting. So, if you don't vote, it's a small fine. Now, you don't have to vote for a candidate. You can go in and just say none of the above, but you still consider a legal mandate for you to vote, and it results in higher voter turnout. But you can also see that other countries have automatic registration, so people are automatically registered, and also have weekend voting, which the United States does not have any of those things. And so that could perhaps explain why the voter turnout rate is low in comparison to other countries. But there are other factors that are going on there as well, and you can read more about that in your textbook. Now, your textbook spends a lot of time talking about who votes, and we're not going to spend time on that in lecture. I will let you go in and look at the multiple factors that explain why people vote. And there are three sort of general categories that help us understand why people vote. And the one that your textbook spends a lot of time on is socioeconomic and demographic characteristics and attitudes about politics. So make sure that you read in the textbook about the way that different groups of voters vote. We know that people who are of a higher economic level and have a higher education level, we know that those folks have the highest voter turnout, right? If you have a job, if you make money, and you are more educated, you're more likely to vote. However, there are a lot of nuances within groups. So in terms of nuances between African American voters and white voters, it used to be that white voters had higher voter turnout rates than African American voters, but that's not true anymore. Men and women vote at about the same rates. Women vote at a little bit of a higher rate than men do, but it's even what's 1 or 2 percentage points of a higher voter turnout is significant when women make up about 51% of the population. Latino Americans and Asian Americans have lower levels of voter turnout, but we also see that that's changing as well. Young people vote at much lower rates than older people, and the impacts that that have. So I'll leave that to you to look and read about that in the textbook, because it's a lot of material and it's easy to understand, and so I didn't put it in the lecture. You'll also learn about political environments during the election. If the election is seen as being really competitive, then in other words, that there's a chance that either candidate can win, that usually increases voter turnout, right? If there are a lot of very important issues that Americans are concerned about, that can have an impact on increasing voter turnout. So you can read more about that in the textbook. But what we're going to focus on is that the state electoral laws and the impact that that can have on voter turnout. So let's turn our sights to that. Now, the Constitution gives states control over elections within their borders, including elections of their senators and their members of the House, and also elections to select the electors that then go on and select the President of the United States. And that's in Article 1, Section 8, that gives states, that's where the Constitution gives states control over elections. What that means is that there's a big patchwork of electoral laws, and all those electoral laws are different state by state. It's not uniform across states within the United States. And so states determine the laws governing voter qualification. They determine, in other words, how long you have to live in a state in order to be deemed a qualified voter. They make rules regarding registration, polling hours, the type of ballots that are going to be used, the kinds of voting machines that are going to be used. That's different state by state. It can sometimes be different, county by county, depending on what state you live in. And so there's a real big patchwork of electoral laws within the United States. Now, do keep in mind that state control over elections must not violate the United States Constitution. So, for example, that states can't say women can't vote because the 19th Amendment trumps state law, okay? And there was some concern recently that as more states instituted voter ID laws, saying that you needed to have a picture ID to vote, there was some concern about whether or not that violates the constitutional provision saying that there will be no poll taxes. Because if you have to pay to get your voter ID, a photo ID, then that, for all practical purposes, becomes a poll tax. And in fact, that's why Wisconsin changed their voter ID law so that you can actually get a voter ID, photo ID for free from the DMV. It's not a driver's license, it's not a state ID, but it's used for voting. That was in order to make sure that our law was constitutional. And so all states implement voting and election laws differently. And there can be very different voter turnout rate depending on the state. And political science has sort of drawn conclusions and done research on the impact that these kinds of laws have on voter turnout. States that implement same-day voter registration tend to have higher turnout rates. Wisconsin and Minnesota have some of the highest turnout rates in the nation, and a lot of folks think that is because we have same-day registration. And so turnout rates, can vary. I mean, Maine has voter turnout rate of about 70% versus Hawaii that has a turnout rate of 42%. And just because you have some convenience voting, which we'll talk about in a minute, that doesn't necessarily mean that your state is going to have high voter turnout rate. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be low. There just seems to be a correlation in terms of same-day registration and voter turnout. So states have different voter registration laws, and they can vary, as I said, from state to state. Depending on what state you live in, there's a lot of variety. I got my PhD in Indiana. I went to Purdue University, and I was sort of shocked to find out when I lived there that you needed to be registered to vote 29 days before the election. And so if you were not registered 29 days prior to the election, you couldn't vote in the election. And I remember running down to the county clerk's office to register to vote because I was kind of taken by surprise that you had to register so soon. Some states have same day registration, and in a second we'll take a look at some of the graphs in your textbook that show you that convenience, those convenience laws. Wisconsin has same day registration, and so if you did not register to vote, you can still vote in the election. You just show up on the day of the election with the required material, and you can register and vote at that time. Some states automatically register you to vote. And so rather than putting the onus on the voter to vote, they basically automatically register you to vote. And so it's not something you have to think about doing, that you are just registered. And it's based on other materials that you present to the state, like when you get your voter ID, then you'd automatically be registered to vote. And so those are just some examples of the differences in terms of voter requirement. As I said, states that have same day registration are usually have a higher voter turnout rates than states where you have to register in advance, and that seems to be conform with what we would expect to take place. Recently, a lot of states have implemented voter ID laws. This is where you have to present a photo ID to vote, and there are different laws across the states regarding that. We'll take a look at the graph in a second. The goal of voter ID laws is to prevent fraud, even though there is, research indicates that there's little to no voter fraud in the United States. There was still a move in the United States in different states to add voter ID laws just to make sure that people were not impersonating other voters. I don't think there's very few cases where people impersonate other voters when they don't have IDs. But regardless, the goal is to prevent fraud, but that it can impose or impede participation for certain groups of people, generally people who are poor, the elderly who may not, like my mom moved from Illinois to Wisconsin to live in assisted living, and she never got a photo ID because she doesn't drive anymore. She didn't go to the DMV. There was no need for it, and it was difficult because she's disabled. And so in Wisconsin, the elderly and disabled do not have to show photo ID. They're exempted from that. But that's not the case in every state, and it can serve as an impediment for participation. Current research shows that it has voter ID laws seem to have a depressive effect of about 2% when you compare a state that didn't have voter ID laws and then they implement one, and then the impact that it has on voter turnout seems like it has about a 2% rate of depression of voter turnout. However, other studies are saying that while there might be a short-term impact on voter ID laws, that short-term impact may go away in the longer run as people get used to the voter ID laws. And so we'll see what happens. Time will tell. This is a graph that shows you in your textbook the different states that have voter ID requirements. And so the states in gray, no voter ID requirement. States in red are strict voter ID requirements. And so you can see that that's where Wisconsin is, and everywhere in between. Your textbook also talks about convenience voting. Kind of raising the question that you can think about is, should it be easier to vote? And so we've already talked about this, but same day or automatic registration is a convenience. It makes it easier for people to vote. And registered voters are more likely to vote. And so that is some conveniences that states have put in place. Now, during this last election, the 2020 presidential election, there was a lot of concern about voting by mail, what's known as no reason absentee voting, and also in-person voting. The Trump campaign and legal team have made lots of claims regarding the fraud that takes place with mail voting, absentee voting, and in-person early voting. None of that has been substantiated by any evidence, and most, if not all of the lawsuits, I think all of the lawsuits so far have been thrown out as being seen as without merit because there's no evidence to support this. And so you do have states like Colorado, Washington, Oregon, that they don't have in-person voting. You just have your ballot sent to you, and everybody votes by mail. Other states allow for absentee voting. You have a choice. You can go in person, or you can request an absentee ballot. Some states you have to give no reason for an absentee ballot. If you just want an absentee ballot, you don't have to give a reason that you're going to be out of town or that you're disabled. You just say this is the preferred method. In Wisconsin during the pandemic, they allowed people to vote absentee without reason. However, generally, if you want to have a absentee ballot into perpetuity in Wisconsin, you do have to demonstrate or you sign a form that says that you need an absentee ballot due to being old or being disabled in some way. And then also there's early in-person voting, so that allows people to vote weeks before the election. Wisconsin has that, but because of some changes to electoral law in Wisconsin, the time for early voting has been reduced recently. And this is a graph, the figure from your textbook that shows you the different kinds of convenience voting. The dark blue states are where it's all mail-in voting. So I'm glad I got that right. Washington, Oregon, Colorado. Same-day registration or automatic registration is states that are circled. And then you see the states, mostly on the eastern corridor that have no convenience voting at all. So, in conclusion, just here's some things to think critically about when it comes to voting and voter turnout. So, you looked at the graphs, you see that we have relatively low voter turnout in the United States. Is low voter turnout a cause for concern? What are the long term implications if the US voter turnout rate remains so low or if it goes even lower? And as we see that there's a correlation between people who are educated and make more money voting and certain minority groups having lower turnout, like Latinos and Asian Americans, I mean, is it concerning that if only certain sectors of our democracy are voting, and why are only certain sectors within our democracy voting? I guess figuring out why people do or do not vote can help us understand whether it's a cause for concern. And also just thinking about it from big picture democracy, if you have only 6 out of 10 people vote in presidential elections, but like 4 out of 10 people vote for congressional elections, and even less for state legislative and municipal elections, does that call into question whether or not the United States is actually a democracy? Can we fairly be characterized as a democracy if too few people of the eligible citizens take part in elections? When it comes to convenience voting, what, if any, mechanisms would you support to make voting easier? Should we move voting day to weekends? Should we make voting day a national holiday? Should we have more convenience voting? And then finally, should states adopt more uniform electoral laws? It is a power that is left to the states to make their own decisions, but there's nothing preventing Congress for giving guidance to states in terms of the types of ballots that they should use, best practices in terms of when polls should be opened, etc. If there was more uniform electoral laws, do you think this would increase trust in the sanctity of the electoral process? All right, thanks a lot for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.